item, which is to discuss and take public comment, if there is any, on the new school building from speakers, guests from Colliers and Tecton, and also we are graced with the presence of our of the chair of our new school building. So thank you all, and
yeah, so good evening, everyone. I'm Al Levitis with Colliers Project Leaders. We're the owner's representative for the town on the new elementary school project. I'm the project manager for the job. Work alongside not only Graham and Bill, but Tecton Architects, who I don't believe are going to be able to make it tonight. Okay, and Gilbane, who's the construction manager for the project. So the point of this little quick discussion update is just that, to provide the Board of Education with an update on how the cost estimates for schematic design went, how that relates to the budget, and then also to present some of the value engineering items that have been coming up as part of the budget exercise, because some few of them relate to the education specifications that came out of the Board of Education. So there's no vote needed tonight. There's no anything approval or anything of that nature. Right now, this is an update, so that way, should there be items that come forth in the January meetings, it's not the first time this group has heard about it. So you'll notice this is the same document that was, I believe it was distributed to the group earlier. I'm not going to read through all the items that were written out, but I want to be able to relate to this document. So in case we're looking at it later, it was the same as what I'm talking about today. So from a very high level, I want to just talk about the budgeting and estimating process as we go through design. Design phase is broken up into schematic phase, schematic design phase, the design development phase, and construction document phase, each with additional levels of detail and the development of the design as you go through. And as part of that process, estimates or the construction cost estimates are provided and developed at each phase as you go along as sort of budgetary checkpoints to make sure your design is in alignment with the budget and you're going down the correct path, so you don't get to the end of a year or a year and a half of design and then find out it's not at all in relation to what you wanted or what the budget supports. So as part of that, we just recently completed the schematic design drawings and the attendant estimates by both Gilbane, construction manager, and the estimator for Tecton Architects. And they take the fraud documents, they go through, they assign values to what they think the estimated costs are. We have reconciliation meetings to make sure that the two estimators are looking at apples to apples. And then from that comes a reconciled estimate for the project. The current reconciled estimate after the schematic design phase was $56.5 million. And that compares to the budgeted portion of that project set at the referendum period at $46.6 million. So there's a $9.9 million overrun from what the estimated budget was. The reasons for it are fairly not unexpected per se, based on some of the economic developments that have happened recently. The budget was developed prior to some of the rampant inflation that you've heard about recently that has definitely hit the construction industry. Also, in addition to that, there was an evolution in the estimated high projection for enrollment since budget. So when the budget was developed, there was an anticipated enrollment of 601. Now the estimated enrollment is 640 students, resulting in a need for additional classrooms to maintain staff and teacher and student ratios. So from both the escalation from inflation and the increase in enrollment, that's the overwhelming majority of why there's this large cost difference between the schematic design estimate and the budget. Just to be clear, the project doesn't need to slash $9.89 million out of the building at this point. Part of the design process is you have a more generalized design and get narrower and narrower and more specific and more specific. But within that, there are design contingencies, project contingencies that are in dollar values, millions of dollar values, that get more refined as you move throughout the process. So like I mentioned, the point is not to cut 9.9 million, but as part of that exercise, you do go through a value engineering process to cut out items that might not be germane to the project, might not be needed, and make sure that as we go on to the design development phase, or rather before we move on to the design development phase, the town is comfortable that the project that has a good plan moving forward, that again meets the needs of the students and staff as well as the financial needs. So the bulk of this value engineering exercise happens through the school building committee. And many of those items are not necessarily related to the day-to-day education of students. For example, one of the items that was in the schematic design called for some nice blue stone pavers out in the front area. Stamped concrete holds up people just as well as blue stone pavers. It's far more economical. So many of those items get vetted through the school building committee and that process. However, as part of the examination of the design, we delve into what areas drove up the cost in the first place. And as I mentioned before, the increase in classroom sizes, increase in number of classrooms rather to meet the additional student projected enrollment. That's something that came up as a big driver of cost. So we delved into all the items that could be potentially sought after for potential cost savings. And some of those relate to the education specifications that came out of the AE effort. The four that I've kind of added a red box here for this meeting are the four that we've looked at to see what value, if any, could be considered as part of the value engineering effort. I'll go into these a little bit more as we go through in the next couple minutes, but at a high level, the four are some of the classroom sizes in terms of square footage, not number of classrooms, but does a classroom need to be as large as it was in the education specifications? The radiant floor heating in the pre-K and K areas, some of the kitchen equipment and its relation to what will actually fit in the square footage identified by the education specifications, and then the breakout of some of the classroom restrooms for grades 1 and 2. So right now, kindergarten through 2nd grade all have in-unit single-use restrooms. Could we combine some of those for grades 1 and 2 and still maintain them in pre-K and K, save out fixtures and help with some of the square footages? Ultimately, the reason why this is being considered is those items above will likely be in the order of $750,000, maybe $1 million worth of value, which is why they're being explored as part of this grander effort to align the budget with the $9.9 million. So again, this was all in the packet, but just in general, the areas on these plans, these were helped develop by the architect, as to how could a reduction in the square footage, what would it look like and how would that be accomplished to actually generate savings? And so, for example, I'll show a breakdown of the classrooms here in a moment, but the idea was that by potentially shrinking in some of the walls, we'd still have same number of classrooms, same general functionality, but by bringing in a couple feet all the way around the building, that's a large square foot savings without mixing whole classrooms and that kind of thing. For comparison, there's also examination of non-programmatic areas shown in orange where corridors and some vestibules could be tightened without affecting classroom sizes at all. It's just, does a corridor need to be 11 feet or can it be 9 feet? That kind of thing. And those haven't been fully fleshed out and designed yet. That's something that the architect will develop. But point being is, obviously, if we're talking about how the classroom sizes work, that's something that the Board of Education should be aware of, because it was ultimately lead in a change to the ed specs if we go down that route. So here's what I was mentioning earlier with regard to some of the classroom sizes where you have the ed specs call for full day kindergartens to be 1,100 gross square feet, or I'm sorry, 1,100 programmatic square feet, where potentially they could be in a range from 900 to 1,000 square feet, still function just as well, just not necessarily as big as 1,100 square feet, and so on and so forth for the various grade levels and the adjacent spaces, the music room, world language room, that align that perimeter of the building. So if you shrink at the wall by a foot or 2 feet or 3 feet or whatever the answer is, those would similarly impact the adjacent areas there. The areas I've highlighted here would be the extent of what was being considered in terms of the red classroom spaces and the blue adjacencies. And again, what would the process would be if we were to go down this route is that the architect would identify what those square footages might be, what the intended cost savings is projected to be, and then ultimately the end specs would be updated if acceptable. Similarly, this is one of the other 4 items that I had mentioned, just where the ed specs call out for in classroom restrooms in grades 1 and 2. So that was one of the items being contemplated for plumbing cost fixture savings. In food services, there was a list of equipment here. The architect was indicating that there was some trouble even fitting this amount of equipment in the specified gross square footage allowed by the ed specs. So there's a conflict there. So rather than increase the size of the kitchen, could we instead reduce the number of equipment, which would generate cost savings? And then the last one was the basically the in-slab, concrete slab floor heating in the pre-K and K areas. Heating in the room just be accomplished by the normal heating that's in the rest of the building rather than having the heated floors for the younger students. So in summary, and what this looks like going forward. So tonight, again, there's no motion, there's no vote, there's no approval needed. This is an update. Give the Board of Education a chance to understand where we're at in the budgetary process and what the value engineering process looks like moving forward. The school building committee has a meeting on December 19th, this upcoming Monday, to review the full value engineering log and what those values would be, and to start to make decisions on whether or not things are acceptable or unacceptable from their charge. If any of the items mentioned here today, in terms of classroom square footages or the toilets or the in-floor radiant heating or the kitchen equipment, were to be something that would want to be entertained from a budgetary standpoint, ultimately would have to come back to the Board of Education for a modification to the education specifications. So that's why it was important to bring this up in December, so that way when your January meetings, if something's coming forth for the BOE, it's not coming out of left field. Ultimately, that's the end of what I had to talk about tonight. So I don't know if Seth or Dr. Cook have anything to add to that or have to answer questions, but really this was an update for you all.
Just a couple of questions, and then open it up anybody on board can ask questions, but a couple that come to mind for me. Do you know offhand what the square footage is for the planned kindergarten and first grade classrooms in the New Wing and Brown?
Don't have that offhand. That's something I could check on as well as the architect there, so they might be able to assist with what the actual numbers are for each of the classrooms.
I believe it to be approximately 900 square feet. I'm looking at Bill.
Yeah, that was my estimate. I could find out. Maybe.
So this was definitely bigger. The new building was definitely bigger to the tune of 100 or 200 square feet.
And was there planned, and again, I don't know if you know, I'm just looking at you because you're the guy standing. Do you know if there was planned floor heating for the similar classrooms at Brown?
I don't believe so.
There was no radiant floor heating plan. There definitely wasn't in the bid.
And that's something that you install while you're doing fresh concrete construction. So
Yeah.
board in place.
Any other questions?
Thank you. I appreciate the update. I have a couple of questions. So this looks like a 20%-ish overage of what the original cost was. I'm just curious if you're seeing this in other projects. And like what percentage of that overage do you think is due to the addition of the classrooms versus inflation and so on? That's my first question.
That's a great question. So typical square foot cost that the industry had seen for this type of building in Connecticut was for a number of years in the 2018, 2019, 2020, even 2021 period at about $365 a square foot. That was well replicated in bids received in other projects throughout the state. That, as of turning into 2022, later 2022, rapidly increased to $400 a square foot, and now we're up to $430, I believe, is what the estimates showed for this So, and that is being replicated in other projects, so we've seen substantiated. So Colliers works on a number of these jobs throughout the state. And we have other projects, and other municipalities that are slightly ahead of this project in terms of bids and estimates and things. And we've seen that increase occur, and it's been difficult to react to it in such a short period of time, needless to say. But yes, this is by no means atypical.
Okay. And then my last follow-up question to that is, can you just remind us all, maybe just for our, the timing, so when we put together the referendum, obviously happened a while ago, but even before that, we could develop this budget and just to sort of compare when these numbers were originally proposed and then where we are now. Do you
So
remember exactly?
the budget, when the referendum was passed, was it February of last year? This year, yes.
But we put together the budget well before that.
Right.
But it kept moving, we had, it didn't get finalized until the budget question got posted, so we were shifting
Always
it.
shifting it,
Yes,
okay.
and Colliers included escalation in that, but more of a standard escalation. I think what could be helpful to, not to sidetrack too much, but there's two pretty big dollar items that are out there. So one being geothermal and one being there is contingency that is beyond the 46 million. Can you speak to that and how that could help bring the 9.9 down potentially?
Yeah, so first, I realized I didn't answer one of your questions was with regard to the additional classrooms needed for enrollment. That square footage, which was 6,000 square feet, it's close to 5,000 square feet, at $400 and something a square foot translates to just over $2 million in just added costs right off the bat. That's
Right.
post referendum.
I see. Okay, that's helpful.
So now getting back to the higher level items, the overall, let's call it the market forces increase of 365 a square foot versus 400 and something. That translates to $5 or $6 million just on the original 82,000 square foot building that was anticipated when the budget was developed going into referendum. Then on top of that, you've got the additional classrooms.
Right.
And on top of that, you've got just additional projected escalation costs. So for example, at the time the budget was developed, 4.5% was in an increased level from what the 3 or 3.5% that had been carried for years and years. Now it's 5.5%. So there's also just a percentage difference between now and midpoint of construction. And then I thought I heard about just geothermal and that sort of thing. That has also increased rapidly as not only the market is developed, but the technology has become more widely accepted, more well known. So we've had projects within the past 2 years go down the geothermal route and have bids that are less than what the estimated for that. So those are some numbers we're finalizing, but there are definitely substantial impacts in some of these big ticket items that we're exploring.
Certainly geothermal was not within the aegis of the educational plan, right? The educational specs, that's for the new school building committee to determine the final design of the heating and cooling, right?
Yeah, so the original education specifications did not include a reference to geothermal. If the group recalls, there was an update, I believe it was May of this past year, where there was an updated version to reflect the increased enrollment. And there was reference to exploring geothermal, something the town was interested in pursuing, but it was not a mandate as a requirement for the project.
So that's not necessarily what we're gonna use.
The education specifications do not require geothermal, but once the school building committee was formed, it was something that was strongly sought after for both sustainable and ongoing maintenance cost reasons.
What about the exterior work? I know one of the things you mentioned, like bluestone versus stamped concrete. What about bluestone, just regular concrete? Why does it have to be stamped? Or, I remember seeing the presentation, there were some really, it looked like high-end architectural style lighting fixtures that were on the outside. Would those make a significant difference at all in the cost of the project without compromising the educational space?
So the site has been a key focus of the value engineering effort for the exact reason that in aggregate, when you take long lineal footage of nice seat walls or
Mhm.
fancy pavers or what have you over a large site as compared to the building footprint, that generates a lot of savings. So a substantial portion of the BE effort is focused on the site because
Okay.
it doesn't, if you're sitting in a classroom, what the type of concrete or whatnot that's on site doesn't impact your learning effort as much as other things inside the building. So everything from finishes and site components and everything is being explored. Ultimately, it's the town's decision how it wants to move the budget forward. So Colliers, Tecton, and Gilbane generate ideas
Okay.
and let the town decide how it wants to pursue those.
Okay, great, thank you.
Hey, Adam, it's Blair Richardson with Colliers. I'm one of the licensed engineers Colliers has on staff to kind of support the OPM effort on this project. The one thing with geothermal that needs to be considered is the life cycle cost. It's an energy efficiency measure more than anything related to the ed spec. So the energy efficiency with geothermal is going to be significantly higher than what you would get with any traditional equipment.
And in addition to that, I know that one of the members of the building committee has been looking into programs, federal and state programs for reimbursement for some of those costs as well. Now, reimbursement doesn't go against our budget. It comes to the town after the fact. But it still may make sense to keep something like a geothermal plan if the net effect is it's going to cost us less over time, it's going to hold up better, it's going to be more sustainable, and we're going to get some money back to the town from it that will offset some of the tax burden potentially for the bonding.
Right, yeah, the new Inflation Reduction Act, there's provisions that the town can take advantage of direct reimbursement of the formerly 30% tax credit, potentially up to 40% tax credit. So the net effect to the overall would actually be cheaper than solid geothermal. But as Seth mentions, the problem is how we treat the money relative to the budget. And
Because
with the
we can't
geo,
go over the budget because that's what we voted.
right, you voted on that, so that's kind of the problem we're facing. I mean, you mentioned the geothermal, we did it on the high school. I mean, on the library, and actually, even though we doubled the size of the library, with the geothermal, the energy bills were half of what the old building was. So the payback there is dramatic.
Is there any indication as to how soon those reimbursements come? I'm just thinking like, what if we had outdoor classroom space that maybe we held off on doing and then we could put reimbursement money towards that
Like a
after
field
the
at the
fact,
bottom.
or like a field or something?
Yeah, I mean,
like
and
that?
that gets into, we're talking with the bond council about that, because, the intent is not to circumvent the vote.
True.
So, things like, could we postpone, we're talking, can we postpone things like demolition of Ryerson out of the budget till we get the money? But the intent is not to be able to do that. So
Okay.
that's kind of, that's why we're facing this problem,
Mhm.
and we'd rather solve this problem with schematic
Yeah.
and kick the can down the road. But some of the things we can wait a little bit, we can wait till the next, deliverable will make a decision. But, my experience is you can find 10%, at this stage, you can find 10% because inherently in the process, there's conservatism in the estimating. And everything. But 20%, you have to really cut some things that are painful to cut. And I was on the high school building committee, and we were faced with these same problems, and that's some of the reasons we got the high school we got.
Mhm.
But that's, not that people want to remember that, but that was, I'm not saying that's gonna happen here, but those are the kind of decisions we're faced with at a 20% overage. So,
So it's not just as simple as a yes, no for many of these items. And I mentioned the pavers as a more simplistic example, but something like geothermal system, whatnot. We have to weigh all of the measures like the cost analysis versus current funding, cash flow, impacts, time of development. There's some more detailed discussions, and that's why the bond council and these kind of things are being considered as for all the decisions that need to be made. All the considerations.
I think I would just like to see, and I hope that the committee considers the fact that things like the heated flooring and the bluestone, how we're saying that, oh, we can have cost savings there. I'm a little bit concerned that it was even in the specs to begin with, because it seems like it's above and beyond what is necessary. And
this was a big ask for our town to spend that kind of money. And I think that it would be prudent to be a little bit more efficient and be aware of how much we're spending. Because if we can make the cuts, then we absolutely should. That's just my 2 cents.
I can be assure you that Bluestone is not gonna make it. It's not gonna- And then some of that, a
And I don't
designer,
know how much other fluff
Right.
is in here.
Well,
But
I
I'm a
will
little-
say the kindergarten students sit on the floor a lot. So it might be
understand that.
considered a more modern, not necessity, but less of a fluff item. If you
Listen,
can
there are
afford it
bugs
to
and
heat the
everyone
floor.
survived it.
Yeah, no, true.
And our buildings are, pretty well heated and cooled, so, I mean, I think that's a luxury item.
And you
in my
can use
opinion.
mats on the floor and other things.
Exactly.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying, I just, for a moment, want to dispel any concern that there's just been willy-nilly crazy over-design
Well, I think
type of stuff going on.
that might be a matter of opinion.
Yeah, it might be.
To me, that's a little over the top.
But I just want to clarify, there are two different things. One was the radiant flooring was something that schools that are designing for pre-K and K now are putting in. I'm not saying that's a hill to die on or something we have to have. The Bluestone was done by the architectural firm that drafted, and again, it's
Right, it's
something
schematic,
else to
sometimes they,
discuss.
you hire,
The
a-
board didn't put that into their ed
Right,
specs. We can't even control if that gets, if that stayed, like if you all said we have to have Bluestone, that might not still make the cut. You all said we had to have radiant flooring, that would potentially stay in, that would.
and another part of the strategy is we have allowances. So the solution is a multi-layer solution, so we could have things that are bid alternate, so we have some flexibility, because right now we're estimating what's gonna cost, but you don't know until bid day what the number is. So we like to have things that we can add and take out, the flexibility, the radiant flooring might be one to do that. I mean, the Bluestone is an embellishment.
Well, it's just that, like, if this wasn't brought to our attention, I wouldn't even have known about the radiant flooring, or, it's like, there's so many different things, right, that are included in this, or could be included, that to have like this itemized list of things that are like, perhaps not necessary, like, unless you bring it to the public's attention, they're not even gonna know.
Well, I mean, and that's why we go through this process. I mean, this is inherited the process of estimating and, vetting it out.
So how many other things are in here that we don't know about that are like that?
But
That was
the board
the
did,
specs, the board told me.
Yeah, the radiant, yeah, it's not uncommon in a modern, kindergarten program. As a desirable thing, sometimes you can't afford it. There's things you want to have and some things you don't have, it's just-
Right, there's want and there's need.
So I understand we have a challenge. 20% is a big number. I've been in building programs before, so I appreciate when I see trying to address that from a design perspective in terms of space. If there's a term in my experience that is a painful one, it's the value engineering. Because in my experience, I trust Bill explicitly on this. I've seen schools where we go through that and you end up with door handles that'll fall off in your hand after 2 years. And a whole host of other things that were value engineered against the original plan.
The gym in the high school.
Rather than cheapening everything, I would rather see us design a more cost-effective design.
And to that point, I would rather see a reduction in the classroom sizes. And I have to say, we acted in good faith as a board and the Colliers and all of our advisors acted in good faith in relying on projections for student enrollment when we headed into the referendum. And we even planned for there was a high, a medium, and a low range. And we planned for the high range to be conservative, and we're now exceeding that. So I would rather see a reduction in the size of each classroom. If we have to cut, a foot around the whole perimeter of the building or something like that, than see a reduction in the number of classrooms. Because I think we don't want to build a new building and find ourselves plopping trailers on it, like right from the outset.
Right.
And I would also be willing to, even as a matter of parity with ground school, I would rather see the elimination of gradient flooring. Not as an economic matter, financial matter, as much as a matter of parity. And, if we could contribute a couple items, consider contributing a couple items that could be looked to by the building committee to contribute against this 20% projected overrun, so that they have some flexibility to be able to bring the cost down of the whole project. I think we should be good scouts and try to do that to some extent if we can.
When we first had the proposal from Colliers, there was a certain percentage built in for inflation, because we had definitely asked about that because of the pandemic and the cost of goods and everything. So what was that percentage that was built in versus what was actually?
Correct. At budget time, it was 4.5% escalation from time of budget through midpoint of construction. The current schematic design estimate, taking both Gilbane, who builds buildings for a living, and the Tecton professional cost estimator, the average escalation was 5.5%, 4.5 to 5.5%.
In terms of cash flows, when would we be able to begin to pre-purchase or lock in certain costs?
That's something that's currently being discussed now for elements such as there's the water line that needs to be brought to the site. So some of those long lead items and items that, for example, 12-inch ductile iron can be very difficult to get sometimes. We're actively discussing that now, both internally as a project team with town finance and state. And the sooner we can start releasing things,
Right.
we'll explore.
How does that mesh with the bond financing, the bands or whatever they are?
That's the reason why we need to make sure we're in line with the director of finance to see what her bond advisor has fleshed out. We've been providing cash flows over all the referendum projects, not just the elementary school. And so we need to get down to the nitty gritty on when funds will be available for those versus just having an idea.
When might that when might that be?
We're having meetings and discussions now
And there are interest rates attached to all that.
with the bond financing. Yes, any.
So then also the interest rates.
Right, that's all part of that to ensure that the amount of money in the budget for the financing aligns with what's actually procured based on the current rates at the time the bonds are procured, cash flows from what's the projects, et cetera.
Any other approval processes other than coming back to the board that possibly in January? Does this need to go to the state or to anyone else for change approval?
So the state approves projects based on the applications.
Yep.
Ultimately, there's a series of plan design or design reviews with the plans with the state. Before you're allowed to go out to bid under a state project, you review that with the state, and there are checkpoint meetings along the way to ensure that it's not going off too much in a crazy direction from what the state thought. So any changes to the ed specs would be DOE, any modifications to the design and underneath the budget authorization, underneath the school building committee. There are also the various reviews through the town staff for code compliance, planning and zoning compliance. There's so many reviews throughout the project process. Yes.
But are we in jeopardy, in other words, if we cut, on the scale of 20% off of the envisioned and planned project that was put to referendum? Really, all that was put to referendum was the budget, right, technically? But the plans for the project had to be approved by the state. So if we're cutting things that the state already approved, is there any jeopardy that attaches that we might run into our plan being unapproved?
Right. So the plan reviews compliance of the design with the stated education specifications. So as long as the modifications to the ed spec are within the Board of Education's approval and within reasonable design, so you're not saying we're gonna have 10 square foot classrooms or something
Yeah.
ridiculous. That's the measuring stick through which the projects get reviewed. Often with projects, as you may have heard in news stories and things, recently, the state will have criteria for classroom sizes that are well below what is reasonable in modern day educational settings for class sizes, programming, things of that nature. And that's just a story when we talk with the state about various projects for various towns. One of the first questions is invariably, how are you doing on square footage? Is it low enough? Are you right sizing your building? Is the typical nomenclature. So having a building be reviewed at, responsibly looked at in terms of right sizing to ensure that the programming is met that meets the education specifications, as well as just common sense, as well as codes and safety and things of that nature. That's what drives the state reviews more than whether or not we had bluestone pavers or whatnot. The state hasn't approved the plans at this point because there aren't plans yet to submit it to the state. They got an application, they got the education specification.
So, any other questions? If not, let's talk about next steps. I guess the next steps would be, we would have to bring up a motion at some point sooner than later to amend the ed specs and have a board vote on that as to what we want to amend, how we want to amend it, and then get a passing vote either to amend or not. How soon could we do that? Could it be the next meeting or?
So I think we're gonna get some important feedback from the building committee after Monday's meeting, and then we'd be looking at, I don't think we want to rush it, so we meet, several times in January to do budget, so I think Adam could give us an idea.
When the scope is defined in alignment with the budget, and there's, right now there's ranges on classrooms. There wouldn't be ranges in the ed spec, it would be, this is what the plan is in terms of how many square foot, if that needs to be changed, or radiant flooring or whatnot. And then that would be brought back to the board as a modified document in the same way that the ed specs were modified last time. And that would be what the motion would be. If there's, as part of this, if there was any items that were more or less palatable or problematic, that's something that could be fed in now into the school building committee process. But otherwise, that motion would be for a proposal to the modified ed specs based on the SBC's evaluation of the value engineering effort.
I have one more question. So originally when we had talked about classroom sizes, we were going with the thought that we had room for growth. And now we already are realizing that growth. So are we going to still have room for growth if the growth becomes bigger? Or are we kind of like, this is it?
So right now, the enrollment projection that that 640 number that I mentioned, that's the high projected enrollment. The state allows over 8 years, but it was 10 that the demographer went out. So it contemplates that high watermark. There have been, for example, towns, South Windsor's one, where as they went through, there were spikes in enrollment. And depending on, even as they were in the middle of construction, we've got another 40 students happening. There are means and methods to address that as you move through the process, depending on the order of magnitude. Is it 1 student? Is it 100 students? There could be a communication with the state. There could be additional funding. There could be a number of mechanisms dependent upon the situation. So I know we've, as a project team and with town leadership, have talked about these types of things in terms of is the enrollment projections keep going, what happens? So those are in constant feedback as we go through this process.
I believe, though, we use the median projection from Slant Collaborative, not high. 600. I could be wrong on that. So they're looking at, because we just got the NESDEC one, we were going out for another one with Slant, but I believe what we submitted to the state was the median projection.
My understanding is that the plan design that they're working towards includes some swing space that could be used, recaptured as.
Yeah, so
swing
for
space.
instance, it's not uncommon that Spanish could be taught in the classroom. not uncommon for certain things to make shifts. We looked at offices being close together that could then become a classroom or back to offices, kind of easily. So yeah, I think we've designed it with wanting to have space for all those things, but I think that there's certainly some ways to work around bubbles coming through. We have an extra, we have 3 pre-K classrooms right now. We have 4 because we're anticipating some increase. But if that doesn't materialize, we could, that could be a kindergarten classroom, and that, kind of down that line, we create some space. Brown could potentially, this is something far out there, hopefully, but Brown could potentially accommodate a few more students. So could the line be redrafted? That would not be highly popular, but potential to look at it. We had to, not a whole lot, because again, we're maximizing space in Brown. It has space right now, but it would not much space going forward. So.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Graham and Billy.
Thank you.
If there are no other questions, then we'll be in touch.
Assuming you'd be joining us on Monday?
Yeah. Exactly.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Yeah.
All right,
No.
so, is there any public comment? No, online. All right, then let's go ahead and discussion.